All right, well, it's great to have you, the faithful few, here. It's great to have you here for this Gaskin lecture. This is a public lecture, and so I'm delighted to begin our time today by inviting a good friend of mine, Pesach Walicki, a rabbi friend from Israel, and I'm going to ask Pesach to come up, and I want you to get to know him a little bit, and him to share a little bit about some of the things that he's doing here on campus. He was with... let's see, you're with 3 classes today?
Yeah.
Is that right? And that's for you.
Yeah, I'm with 3 classes today.
All right, so Pesach, tell us a little bit about yourself and how we came to know each other and then what you're doing now.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Thomas. Again, my name is Rabbi Pesach Walicki. And I lead an organization based in Jerusalem called the Center for Jewish Christian Understanding and Cooperation. And as our name implies, our name is itself a description of what our mission is. Our mission is really to build stronger bridges of relationship, connection, understanding, and cooperation between the Jewish and Christian communities. We live in a time where we're starting, after thousands of years of kind of looking at each other in a more negative light, we're in a time now where Jews and Christians are starting to recognize that we have a lot more in common than what divides us, and starting to build those relationships. So my main focus for the last number of years is really building relationships with Christian academia and academic institutions. I first met Dr. Thomas, back in 2017 or 18. I came for a visit here, and he was just a lowly professor at the time. And I walked into his office, and we sat and talked, and I felt like I'd known him ever since we were standing side by side at Mount Sinai. And then in 2019, Dr. Thomas joined me on a trip that our organization led for a group of professors from various Christian seminaries around the United States. And he was one of the participants on that trip, and the bond only grew from there. And I'm here today giving some guest classes and a number of classes here, and we're having conversations about future cooperation so that we can do some things on this campus so that as part of your Christian education, you'll also understand where the Jewish community is coming from and have a deeper understanding of us across the aisle. So that's why I'm here, and I hope to be back. So those of you who are here for a few more years, hopefully you'll be seeing me again, unless I get chased off campus for something offensive that I might say. I'll try to watch myself. But that's what I do. That's what I'm working on. We have an upcoming trip of professors from just like that one in 2019, and Dr. Raphael Bello is going to be joining us on that trip. So the connection with OBU is only going to continue. So thank you very much, Dr. Thomas, for having me up here, and God bless all of you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Matt, you can take this. Thanks, Raphael. So I wanted you to get to hear a little bit from Rabbi Walicki because one of the things that he shares is a deep concern for this generation, your generation. That's part of the impetus behind the work that he's doing. And, I wouldn't be giving my life to doing what I'm doing if I didn't have a passion for this generation as well. Now, I like to cook. That's one of the things I like to do. And one of the things I like to do when I cook is ask the question, go into my fridge or go into my pantry and look at things and just kind of say, what are we going to do with this, right? And, it could be something weird like a can of, what is that, pureed pumpkins or something like that. Or it could be something, as simple as chicken tenderloins or something like that. Just, you look at it and you say, what am I going to do with this? And part of the fun of cooking is figuring out the inner potential of this food, the raw potential, and then it's created into something delicious. I love that. Because I just like to ask that question, what are we going to do with this? I'll tell you that story because I think when it comes to this generation, I have the same question. What are we going to do with this generation? And that is the topic, and that's the title of this lecture. What shall we do with this generation? Now, I can ask that question as an outsider, which I am an outsider to your generation. I'm a Generation X person. Most of the people in this room, if you were born from, say, 1997 to 2012, you are not a Generation X person. You are not a millennial. You are Generation Z. So when I ask the question, what shall we do with this generation, I'm asking the question, particularly, what shall we do with the generation called Generation Z? And you can ask this question, like I am, from an outsider, but I would just encourage you to think about this not just as an outsider's perspective. I would try and encourage you to think about it from an insider's perspective, as one from that generation. So whether an outsider or an insider, what shall we do with Generation Z? Well, in my brief talk today, what I'd like to do is encourage or identify 3 things that we can do that will help us as we think through Generation Z. And why am I talking about Generation Z? Well, when we think about Generation Z, first of all, you need to understand, many of you in this room are part of Generation Z. Your generation comprises the largest generation in American history. And what that means is, ladies and gentlemen, you're part of something massive and historic. The largest generation in American history. Second thing that we know about Generation Z, different from the previous generations that have gone before, you are the most ethnically diverse generation that's walked the fields of North America. You're the most ethnically diverse generation in American history. So about 50% of Generation Z are often identified or labeled as quote-unquote underrepresented minorities. This generation as a whole is not only the most ethnically diverse, the reality is you are the most populous. So about 27% of the American population is your generation. So it's an interesting group that you're a part of. How have people described you? Well, have you ever heard of this? Some have labeled this generation, Generation Z, as the snowflake generation. Has anybody ever heard of that? Don't throw tomatoes at me. I'm just saying what people have said. Now, why? Because this generation, it is argued, this generation takes offense more quickly than previous generations. Now, you might be thinking about your own life or your own experience. You might be thinking, well, is that really true? Well, it may be, but I have questions about that. And let me tell you why. Because perception that you are a generation that's more easily or more apt to take offense, I'm not sure that that's actually true. I do wonder if it's more likely the case that offenses are more readily on display because of social media. You are also the most connected generation that's ever gone on in North America. So as a result, this generation, like the rest of us now, are hypersensitized to any and all kinds of offenses, real or perceived. And this vortex of social media generates literally a flood of alerts, and those alerts then suck us all down past the event horizon into the black hole of offense. And so when I hear this language of snowflake generation, I'm just not sure that that's right. And if you're offended by that phrase or that title, I think that's probably good that you are, because I'm not sure that's true to reality. After all, when we're talking about this generation does not know life without a smartphone, or at least some sort of personal device. And we know that the smartphone was created in 2007, and personal devices emerged in the same span of time. This means that you as a generation are all extraordinarily tech-savvy and incredibly digitally smart. And this generation the projections are trending this way, that by 2023, this year, TikTok will be your favorite app. It's going to outpace your use of Instagram. I'm not sure how I feel about that. But it's quite clear that you are extraordinarily tech savvy. Now, interestingly about your generation, you also grew up in a time of recession. And this gets to the issue of snowflake generation a little bit, that label that people put on you. I'm just not sure it's accurate. Think about the time in which this generation, Generation Z, grew up. You grew up in a time of recession. The recession beginning in 2008. Now this, according to all statistics, has shaped your ideals. It's also fueled your skepticism. Two aspects of Generation Z. Strong ideals, but also very skeptical. As a result, you're generally careful. You're generally wise when it comes to spending money. But make no mistake, this generation will spend money. Why? This generation is estimated to be the most powerful economic force the nation has ever seen. At least until generation that comes after you, also called Generation Alpha, takes the reins. And let me tell you, Generation Alpha is coming. Anybody born after 2012. So what should we do with you as a generation? Now, some of the characteristics that I've identified, probably I've missed aspects of you and your experience. What I've just done is not designed to be totalizing or comprehensive. It's indicative of this generation based on sociological research done on this group. So what should we do with this generation? This is the first thing that I'd like to say. What should you do with your generation? How should we think about this generation? Here's the first thing I want to say. We need to believe in this generation. Let me say that again. We need to believe in this generation. Why? Because this generation uniquely, because of its economic force and its economic potential, but also the sheer number of people that you have in your generational grouping, but also the ideals that you have, your experience, what this means is you are uniquely situated, uniquely positioned. You uniquely have the potential to be extraordinary agents of good in our communities, in our families, and around the world. You see things right now that generations that have gone before you simply do not. Because you are more ethnically diverse as a generation than those that have gone before, you naturally see things about ethnic disparities that make you wonder, why is this the case? Does it have to be the case? You're thrifty. You're technologically savvy. You see diversity as normal, as expected. You want positive, healthy communities where connection isn't just an ideal, it's a reality. You see things other generations do not. You experience things other generations do not. And as a result, my argument is we should believe in you as a generation. We should not cast you aside, nor should we castigate you for your individuality. We should believe in the possibility of what God can do in and through you. This generation has the capacity for the Lord Jesus to work through your life so the world might be changed. And I don't just say this as a general kind of bumper sticker kind of idea. You have extraordinary potential to be used so that the world might be changed. I say it this way. Don't let anyone tell you differently. You are fundamentally agents of transformation and good in our world. So don't let someone else's label detract you from that fact. We who are on the outside should believe in the generation of you who are on the inside. We should believe in your capacity for good, for help. This generation can do that. But I would just say, it's up to you. It's by no means certain that you will do that. A desperate need today is for what two economists, Bob Kutzward and Robert DeLong, they've described as an economy of care. Care for the poor, a care for one another, a care for the world in which we live. And Bob Kutzward was a Dutch member of parliament. He taught at the Free University of Amsterdam and wrote a number of works on economy. He's a devout Christian, or was a devout Christian man. And he said, instead of just thinking about capitalism and progress, not bad things, good things, but what we need to do as followers of Jesus is to provide an economy of care. I think that's interesting. Are we there right now? No, we're not. What we need is an economy of care. What we have is what sociologist René Girard describes as a hurricane of desire. And far too often, Christians are fast asleep, like Jonah, at the bottom of the boat, even as the storm gathers momentum and threatens to wash us all off the deck. It's too often that those who are not followers of Jesus, who are most concerned about the storm that we face in our Western world, as Western Christians, are asleep in the bottom of the boat. We're pursuing consumer churches, consumer goods, submerged in the idolatry of our day. Interestingly, this generation has the capacity to rise above that. This generation has the capacity to remember that we are experiencing and living in a lost and broken world that needs Jesus. We need his lordship in all spheres of human existence. But by all measures, this generation remains extraordinarily dissatisfied with the picture of reality I've just painted. You don't want to be asleep in the bottom of the boat. Some of us recognize you asking this question in light of what we've seen, for instance, in the revivals at Asbury, the experience that we had here, the experiences of other college students across the campuses, across this nation. This generation is asking the question, are we going to be a revival generation? A generation that sees God on the move? Well, I pray that this is the case. At least this is the opportunity. So we must believe in you. So the first response that I would say, what are we going to do with this generation? I would just say that we need to believe in you. And you need to believe in what God can do in and through you. Second, what are we going to do with this generation? I would say we need to encourage this generation. And I want everyone to hear me, especially on this point. When we think about this generation, we need to recognize that far from being snowflakes, struggles are extraordinarily real. This generation has seen many struggles. First, let's just consider the fact that you as a generation have grown up in the midst of war. And you say, really? Yes, absolutely. Think about your history. This generation grew up in the midst of war. The war on terror, 9/11, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq. War was this generation's bread and butter. That has an impact on how you perceive reality and how you engage the world. This generation, Generation Z, also addresses and engages serious realities of mental health. According to recent research, listen to this, only 45% of your generation, Generation Z, reports that their mental health is very good or excellent. You say, well, 45%, 4 out of 10 isn't bad, right? Well, that's according to the American Psychological Association. Listen to this. All other generations have better mental health outcomes. So millennials, 56% report positive mental health. Gen X's, my generation, we're pretty negative, 51%. Boomers, castigated for the fact of being boomers, their mental health is 70% positive mental health. So what I'm saying is, when you look at your generation, mental health is a real challenge. And what impacts the mental health of your generation? Well, a number of things. Your generation uniquely knows, because it's plastered all over the news, and because it's real, school shootings, student debt, joblessness, politics. All of these are realities, according to sociological data, that demonstrates indicators of poor mental health. I'd also say that technology also plays a role. Growing up in a hyper-connected world can evoke intense feelings of isolation and loneliness in some Gen Zers. It can also fuel a steady drumbeat of negative news stories. It generates a fear of missing out, shame, and falling short of a social media-worthy standard. I don't look like that. I'm not as popular as they are. And as a result, negative mental health emerges. What else impacts you? Well, as we all know, COVID-19 has impacted this generation. We experience that impact here on campus. Educational and social experiences have changed. The baselines have changed. Disconnection and social anxiety in that period of time, past 3 years, has increased significantly. Learning has moved, for many places, completely online. More than that, post-COVID-19, economies are destabilized and we live downstream of inflation and potential recession. This generation has had to deal with sickness, illness, death of loved ones and friends, and it's caused this generation, particularly in some cases, to have to step up as caregivers. So, in light of this, it is no surprise that mental health challenges and concerns have climbed. Across the world, rates of depression and anxiety rose by more than 25% just in 2020. If that's true all across the globe and the incidence is higher in Generation Z, you can see struggles are real. So what should we do with this fact? My encouragement to you is we should be encouraging this generation. And let me just sit here for just a minute. We should be encouraging your generation. And what I mean by that is we should be a generation who comes alongside and gives a helping hand, an encouraging word, friendly advice, a listening ear. We should be encouraging this generation. Those of us who are on the outside should be modeling what encouragement looks like to you. But as you learn, you should be modeling what that looks like to others. So not only do we want to recognize this generation needs encouragement, we on the outside need to encourage this generation. Third thing, when I think about this generation and the realities that you face, my encouragement would be that we challenge this generation. This is the third point in this lecture. We should challenge you as a generation. Now, there's a couple of ways to think about this imperative or this word challenge. Challenge us. Okay. There's a couple of ways to think about that word. One of the key points that emerges from this lecture is that we must challenge you as a generation. Challenge one another. What do I mean by this? Well, whenever you think of this word challenge, this is a challenge that I'm going to overcome. That's oftentimes how we think about this language of challenge. Sometimes we might think of it as a do better, be better kind of challenge. I'm reminded early in the 20th century, a newspaper sent out a question to various authors. And it's said that this was like the New York Times sent this out, but the question was, what's wrong with the world? Okay, so they sent this out to various authors and they asked the question, what's wrong with the world? What's wrong? And what the New York Times wanted was to get these key thinkers, these authors, they wanted their ideas on how to respond. What's wrong with the world? Well, Alan Noble, tell us what's wrong. Early 20th century. Alan wasn't alive yet, right? But G.K. Chesterton was. And if you don't know who G.K. Chesterton was, he was a Christian thinker, early 20th century. And it's reputed that the Times sent this question to G.K. Chesterton. What's wrong with the world? What do you think how he responded? What do you think he said? Well, he didn't type an email, right? He didn't send a text. He wrote a letter and sent it via post, a letter carrier, back to the Times. And when they opened the letter, they found this letter enclosed. To the question, what's wrong with the world? G.K. Chesterton says, "Dear sir, I am." Yours truly, G.K. Chesterton. So what's wrong with the world? I am. That was his response. What's wrong with the world? I am. So very true. But is that our response when we think about what's wrong with the world? Now, it's easy to say, well, when I think about what's wrong with the world, it's them. Them. That party. That group. Them. There. Out there. But the Christian faith, which Chesterton knew very well, reminds us that there are many problems out there. But one thing is common to all the problems in our world, and that is I, myself, me, my, we. Not them. Them thinking likes to lay blame at the feet of others. And it's true that there's certainly lots of blame to go around in our world. But them thinking, I would just encourage us and challenge this generation not to fall into the trap of them thinking. We need to think about ourselves. Not in a selfish way, but what's wrong with the world? Me. Us. We. I like the book of Ecclesiastes, not only because I'm an Old Testament professor, but also because Ecclesiastes is ancient wisdom. Ecclesiastes 1:4, particularly, if you haven't read Ecclesiastes, I would encourage you to do so. It's a weird book. I like it very much. It's like almost postmodernism encapsulated, 2,000 years before the fact. But it's a fascinating book. Ecclesiastes 1:4 is a piece of ancient wisdom. And it says this. It's kind of skeptical, but it really does ring true. It says this, and I quote it here. Quote, "A generation goes, and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever." In other words, a generation comes and a generation goes, and then he keeps going on in verse 5. He says, the sun rises, sun goes down, and hastens to the place where it rises. And what the writer of Ecclesiastes is doing is saying, hey, look, generations come, generations go. Life goes on. People, are born, people die. Time keeps moving. It doesn't stop for any person. And the point is clear. Generations come, generations go. And why do I bring that to our mind when I'm talking about them or me thinking, or them versus we? Because here's the reality. In Ecclesiastes, generation comes, a generation goes. Here's the reality. Them, for Ecclesiastes, is actually we. Them is now us. The idea that each generation is better or worse, or we're better than them, and they're not as good as we, that's actually extraordinarily naive. A mature reflection on reality reminds us that one generation has goods and ills, and the generation that follows has goods and ills. This generation, like all of our generations that have gone before, will look back on their world and wonder how we got it so wrong. Paradoxes abound right now in this generation. There's an increase in technological advancement and an increase in mental health challenges. There's an increase in connectivity and a decrease in disconnection, or an increase in disconnection. There's an increase in wealth and a decrease in satisfaction. Paradox after paradox after paradox. One of the things that we could challenge one another in is to do better and be better. I would just say that this is wrong-headed. We might do better. We might be better. But is that the challenge that we need? As I move to land the plane on this talk, I'd like to say, I wonder if there's a different valence to the idea of challenging one another. I'd like to challenge this generation. I wonder if we consider the challenge to look a little bit different. Like, I wonder if we could challenge one another to be kinder. I wonder if we could challenge one another to be humble. I wonder if we could challenge one another to be gracious. I wonder if we could challenge one another to be patient. I wonder if we could challenge one another to be loving. I wonder if we could challenge one another to be measured in our speech. I wonder if we could challenge one another to be just. What I wonder is whether or not this generation has fully embraced virtue. And as an older brother, I do have this question. The capacity is there. But I do wonder, could we embrace virtue? What makes a life worth living? What kind of person do I want to be? What kind of friend do I want to be? In what kind of community do I wish to live? I wonder if we can challenge one another today, not to do better or be better, but to be more like Christ. This generation launches into our world as sheep among wolves. Our world certainly harbors dangers and threats. There are those out there who call good evil and make lies of truth. There are those who call ugly what is beautiful, distorting our God-given vision. But as a generation, I believe that God has placed you in this moment. He hasn't placed you in another moment. It's for you today. This means that God, in His care for your life, has afforded you the opportunity as a generation to step into the moment of today. Why? So that you might bear God's image in the world for His glory and for His fame. So that you might live, so that you might raise your voice for the King. I want to challenge you today. As you think about a generation that you call Generation Z or we call Generation Z, can you step into that moment with the virtues identified above? Can you raise your voice with kindness, with justice, with humility, with peace? If you did, my goodness, what a change that would be. Our world desperately needs your voice. Yours is the generation that can effect positive change if you strike up the courage and step boldly into the moment that we call today. And as an outsider looking in to you as a generation, Generation Z, can I just tell you, we need your influence. And so from Bison Hill, I would just say, go into your world. Start here. Make a difference. Go and live well. Go serve your community. Go serve our God. You're being equipped. Go do something beautiful for God. Don't waste your life. What are we going to do with this generation? It's a tough question. But in this lecture, I've given you 3 points. I think we certainly need to challenge you as a generation. I think we certainly need to encourage you as a generation. Because, my friends, we believe in you as a generation. Thank you for being here at this lecture, and I pray it was an encouragement to you. I had a lot of fun. I was actually prepared to do something completely different, but as I prayed through this time, I felt like this is what really needed to be said. So this is how I prepared this lecture. Thank you all very much. Matt, do we need any other direction? Are our friends here to swipe us? Okay. Thank you all so much. I'll be down here if you have questions, but otherwise, you are dismissed.